Soon after the election, Johnson directed Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach to begin drafting the next civil rights bill, legislation to secure equal voting rights. In his memoir, Johnson reflected, "In many ways, I believe this act would be even more critical than the previous one. Once the black man's voice could be translated into ballots, many other breakthroughs would follow, and they would follow as a consequence of the black man's own legitimate power as an American citizen, not as a gift from the white man." On November 19th, the working groups went to Johnson with an interim report, the three options under consideration being continuing as present with the goal of working towards a settlement, sharply increasing military pressure in Vietnam with the long-term goal of negotiating, and slowly increasing military operations against Hanoi while also working to begin peace talks. Johnson is recorded to have requested not making a firm decision without fully consulting the relevant military people, and Valenti told him that he needed to sign the Joint Chiefs to any decision so as to cover their flank in the event of a later investigation. Johnson's caution was part of his reluctance to do anything that might distract attention from Great Society reforms, viewing Vietnam as a possible trap that could both frustrate his principal goals and injure him politically. He compared the situation of the South Vietnamese government and himself to a man in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, standing on a newspaper. With no escape from disaster, he could either move left or right, or stand still before sinking. Dalek calls it an apt metaphor, and notes that LBJ's fundamental belief that U.S. national security dictated against abandoning Vietnam meant that he would risk the adverse consequences of a larger war. Throughout winter 1964 and 1965, Johnson was pressured more often by hawks than doves, complaining that all the military chiefs did was come in every morning and tell him bomb, 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 and then come back in the afternoon and tell him bomb, bomb, bomb. Johnson's principal advisors backed using force to resist communist takeover in South Vietnam. And although polls did not show a well-defined majority in favor of escalation, a plurality supported some military action against the communists. Joe Alsop and Congress conservatives urged stronger measures, with Alsop writing a column on December 23rd that Americans stationed in Saigon were convinced Johnson was pressured to accept defeat, and wrote another column comparing Johnson to JFK's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If Mr. Johnson ducks the challenge in Vietnam, we shall learn by experience about what it would have been like if Kennedy had ducked the challenge in October 1962. Dalek writes, still, in the closing days of 1964, despite his national security and domestic political concerns, Johnson had doubts that restrained him from more decisive action. Would the country be better served by throwing itself into a possible unwinnable fight, or by delaying defeat, holding back from full-scale involvement, and using our resources to meet the communist threat on more manageable ground? John Corson, a Johnson friend from NYA days and the head of a task force on income maintenance, remembers a White House meeting of task force chairman at the time. The most impressive thing of the evening was the president's discussion of Vietnam, which lasted between 1 and 2 hours, and his seeming involvement in Vietnam, to the exclusion of almost everything else. Johnson said, "I've tried this to get out of Vietnam. I've tried that. I've tried everything I can think of. What can I do next?" With still no clear answers to his question, Johnson followed his political instincts. When confronted by sharp divisions of opinion throughout his career, he had almost always adopted a moderate position, identifying himself as an accommodationist who reflected the national desire for compromise rather than ideological rigidity. On January 2nd, King delivered a speech at Selma's African Methodist Episcopal Church, in which he declared that in the event state and county authorities did not meet black demands for the vote, we will seek to arouse the federal government by marching by the thousands to the places of registration. King was hit in the head by a member of the National States Rights Party and then kicked in the groin. 4 days later, Johnson received a report from Bill Bundy on morale in Saigon being more shaky than ever, due to a widespread feeling that the U.S. was not ready for stronger action and seeking to withdraw. Bundy urged for stronger U.S. action to both improve the Vietnam situation and to hold the next line of defense, namely Thailand. Johnson was not convinced to make new decisions by the warning, refusing during his cables with Taylor the next day and on the 14th to commit to a North bombing campaign. On January 26, Johnson was informed that New York Times correspondent Peter Gross had expressed the next 6 months might mark the end, and for the president to explore every opportunity to withdraw with honor. McBundy and McNamara told the president that the current passive policy would only lead to disastrous defeat, and LBJ agreed to more aggression. On January 27th, McBundy sent Johnson a memo in which he and McNamara agreed that the current Vietnam policy would lead only to disastrous defeat. Johnson directed Russ to ask his experts to consider all options possible to find a peaceful solution, and requested Bundy go out to Saigon with a team of military and civilian experts for a look at the situation. On January 20th, Johnson was sworn in to a full term as president.
In a land of great wealth, families must not live in hopeless poverty. In a land rich in harvest, children just must not go hungry. In a land of healing miracles, neighbors must not suffer and die untended. In a great land of learning and scholars, young people must be taught to read and write. For more than 30 years that I have served this nation, I have believed that this injustice to our people, this waste of our resources, was our real enemy. For 30 years or more, with the resources I have had, I have vigilantly fought against it. I have learned and I know that it will not surrender easily. But change has given us new weapons. Before this generation of Americans is finished, this enemy will not only retreat, it will be conquered. Justice requires us to remember when any citizen denies his fellow, saying his color is not mine, or his beliefs are strange and different. In that moment, he betrays America, though his forebears created this nation. I do not believe that the Great Society is the ordered, changeless, and sterile battalion of the ants. It is the excitement of becoming, always becoming, trying, probing, falling, resting, and trying again, but always trying and always gaining. In each generation, with toil and tears, we have had to earn our heritage again. If we fail now, then we will have forgotten in abundance what we learned in hardship. That democracy rests on faith. That freedom asks more than it gives. And the judgment of God is harshest on those who are most favored. If we succeed, it will not be because of what we have, but it will be because of what we are. Not because of what we own, but rather because of what we believe.
On February 9th, Johnson met with King after the civil rights leader met with Humphrey and Katzenbach. A requirement of the meeting was King issuing a statement on Johnson's commitment to voting rights and intention to introduce a bill. King told reporters of the president's intention to do this very soon, a biographer noting that MLK returned to the South knowing that further interest in voting rights problems and the Selma campaign needed to be stirred. Violent confrontations continued over the next several weeks. This included a demonstrator being shot in the stomach by a state trooper, King announcing on March 3rd that he would lead a walk from Selma to the Alabama state capital of Montgomery starting on March 7th. Johnson and King met again on March 5th, with King later saying that Johnson did not tell him what exactly his voting proposal would be, and that the president offered no promises. LBJ seemingly told him that civil rights groups could make mistakes that would hurt national interest in voting legislation. On March 6, Wallace banned the March 7th walk as likely to endanger the public safety. 600 demonstrators went on with the march anyway. They crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge and confronted some 50 state troopers and dozens of Clark deputies, blocking their path on U.S. Highway 80. They warned the marchers to disperse and gave them 2 minutes to leave before rushing forward and beating them with clubs, driving them back across the bridge. The incident, which had seen the use of tear gas, clubs, whips, and mounted horsemen, resulted in 17 marchers needing hospitalization, along with 40 needing treatment for minor injuries. National reaction to what would be called Bloody Sunday was supportive of voting rights law advocates. Televisions and newspapers featuring graphic descriptions of the police's actions. In a March 9th statement, Johnson said he had directed the Justice Department to enter the case as a friend of the court so they can present its recommendations and otherwise assist the country in every manner in resolving the legal issues involved in the case. He pledged his administration would work with the individuals involved to relieve tensions and to make it possible for every citizen to vote. On March 13th, Johnson and Wallace met at the White House, the president's objective being to put Wallace on the spot to make clear that he would back the legitimate demands of the protesters and tell him that he needed to protect peaceful demonstrators from police violence. Johnson received Wallace in the Oval Office, having him sit on a couch with soft cushions. Johnson himself sat in a rocking chair that let him lean downward until their noses almost touched. LBJ told Wallace that he knew he was like him in opposing brutality, and handed him a newspaper of a state trooper kicking a protester after the latter had been knocked to the ground. After Wallace tried to justify the incident as being isolated and the officer just doing his duty, Johnson pressed him to acknowledge there was brutality and asked the governor to persuade Alabama registers to give blacks the constitutional right to vote. Wallace claimed to not have the wherewithal to sway the local officials, LBJ replying, "Don't shit me about your persuasive power, George. I saw you attacking me on television, George, and you know what? You were so damn persuasive that I had to turn off the set before you had me changing my mind." Johnson followed up by asking why he would not just desegregate the schools, and Wallace claimed that was in the power of the school boards. Johnson hammered at the governor for 3 hours, the latter remarking after the meeting, "Hell, if I'd stayed in there much longer, he'd have had me coming out for civil rights." Johnson told a press conference that he wanted to eliminate the deep and very unjust flaw in American democracy through sending Congress a voting rights law enforcing the constitutional guarantee against barring people from the polls due to their race or color. Of Wallace, Johnson said the governor wanted law and order. Johnson later replied to Wallace's request for help to protect the marchers by sending in 1,800 Alabama National Guardsmen into federal service. Johnson was compelled to go before Congress with a special message on the constitutional violation of black rights.
Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult. But about this, there can and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. Yet the harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Every device of which human ingenuity is capable has been used to deny this right. The Negro citizen may go to register only to be told that the day is wrong, or the hour is late, or the official in charge is absent. And if he persists, and if he manages to present himself to the registrar, he may be disqualified because he did not spell out his middle name or because he abbreviated a word on the application. And if he manages to fill out an application, he is given a test. The registrar is the sole judge of whether he passes this test. He may be asked to recite the entire Constitution or explain the most complex provisions of state law. And even a college degree cannot be used to prove that he can read and write. For the fact is that the only way to pass these barriers is to show a white skin. Experience has clearly shown that the existing process of law cannot overcome systematic and ingenuous discrimination. No law that we now have on the books, and I have helped to put 3 of them there, can ensure the right to vote when local officials are determined to deny it. In such a case, our duty must be clear to all of us. The Constitution says that no person shall be kept from voting because of his race or his color. We have all sworn an oath before God to support and to defend that Constitution. We must now act in obedience to that oath. But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome. As a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are. I know how difficult it is to reshape the attitudes and the structure of our society. But a century has passed, more than 100 years, since the Negro was freed. And he is not fully freed tonight. It was more than 100 years ago that Abraham Lincoln, a great president of another party, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But emancipation is a proclamation and not a fact. A century has passed, more than 100 years, since equality was promised. And yet the Negro is not equal. A century has passed since the day of promise, and the promise is unkept. The time of justice has now come. And I tell you that I believe sincerely that no force can hold it back. It is right in the eyes of man and God that it should come. And when it does, I think that day will brighten the lives of every American. For Negroes are not the only victims. How many white children have gone uneducated? How many white families have lived in stark poverty? How many white lives have been scarred by fear because we've wasted our energy and our substance to maintain the barriers of hatred and terror? And so I say to all of you here and to all in the nation tonight, that those who appeal to you to hold on to the past do so at the cost of denying you your future. This great, rich, restless country can offer opportunity and education and hope to all black and white, all north and south, sharecropper and city dweller. These are the enemies. Poverty, ignorance, disease, they are enemies, not our fellow man, not our neighbor. And these enemies too, poverty, disease, and ignorance, we shall overcome.
Dalek hails the address as Johnson's greatest speech and one of the most memorable presidential addresses in American history. On the afternoon of February 6, word came that communists had attacked U.S. Army advisors' barracks at Pleiku and an American Army helicopter base several miles away, killing 8 Americans and injuring over 100. Johnson's advisors urged for an answer of striking 4 North Vietnamese targets immediately. Vance, who had been in the Situation Room talking on the phone with Mac Bundy, said that it was the latter's recommendation for them to proceed with airstrikes at once. Johnson raised the question of American dependence on Saigon and other parts of South Vietnam. Wheeler and McNamara recommended getting them out immediately, and Johnson said, "I just cannot think about losing American women and children in an attack by the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong in Saigon or elsewhere." On February 8th, LBJ attended a cabinet room meeting with members of the National Security Council and principal aides, everyone present having either read the Bundy report or being aware of its elements. Johnson decided to order continuing air attacks, being unhappy about it and unsure if it was the right decision. As abandoning Vietnam was unacceptable, his only other option was forceful action, which he did not want to make evident to Congress, the press, or the public. McNamara declared that the U.S. would just have to bomb once a week to keep up morale in Saigon. When congressional leaders joined the meeting, Johnson said they were now ready to return to our program of pushing forward in an effort to defeat North Vietnamese aggression without escalating the war. LBJ asked those present to not describe administration actions as broadening the war. The bombing campaign, called Rolling Thunder, was initiated on February 13th. Dalek observes that while Johnson declined to publicize the expanded air war as to not distract either Congress or the public from his reform agenda, he furthers, not going public with the bombing campaign was a form of denial. No announcement was a way not only to mute the reality of the fighting, but also to keep it from gaining an importance Johnson did not wish it to have. As Lady Bird remembered of LBJ, he had no stomach for it, no heart for it. It wasn't the war he wanted. The one he wanted was on poverty and ignorance and disease, and that was worth putting your life into. And yet every time you took it to the people, every time you said anything in a speech about civil rights, your audience would begin to shift their feet and be risitive and silent and maybe hostile. But then the moment you said something about defending liberty around the world, bear any burden, everybody would be cheering. On the 15th, Vice President Humphrey wrote Johnson of the need for the administration to have sustained public support for their actions in Vietnam, noting the U.S. had this in its involvement in both world wars. LBJ, dissatisfied with both Humphrey's warnings and criticisms, did not want to confront the issues he was raising. After Fulbright told Johnson that Humphrey had introduced him to men who thought Vietnam could be resolved if the U.S. replaced its military provincial proconsuls and advisors with civilians who knew the people there, Johnson replied, "In a choice between Humphrey and General Taylor as our major strategist, I am disposed towards Taylor." Humphrey would later reflect that he had little access to Johnson over the next several months, along with adding little to the Vietnam discussion, with his counsel less welcome. Johnson met with former President Eisenhower on February 17th for 4 hours in the cabinet room and during lunch. Eisenhower stressed the South Vietnamese needed to have morale, which he believed could be undermined by North Vietnam infiltrating the men and supplies of the South, and that American strikes could discourage North Vietnam and make them pay a price for being aggressive. Johnson asked Eisenhower of China or the Soviet Union getting involved in Vietnam, and the former president told the incumbent that he should quietly warn them of dire results in the event they threatened to intervene. At a February 25th meeting, Johnson told congressional leaders that he was trying everything he could think of. In March, Johnson told Eric Goldman that Rolling Thunder would make North Vietnam settle with the U.S. within a year to 18 months. In late March, Johnson made the decision to give a speech at Johns Hopkins University with 3 aims. The first being to demonstrate administration policy towards Vietnam was not confused and erratic, and how it was in line with the U.S. policy of the last 10 years. The second being unconditional discussions for peace to silence critics calling him a warmonger, and the third to clear the desk for an escalation acceptable to most Americans and force a negotiated peace settlement for South Vietnam's independence in the event there was no productive result from a talks proposal. Johnson spoke at Johns Hopkins on April 7th.
The world as it is in Asia is not a serene or peaceful place. The first reality is that North Vietnam has attacked the independent nation of South Vietnam. Its object is total conquest. Of course, some of the people of South Vietnam are participating in attack on their own government, but trained men and supplies, orders and arms flow in a constant stream from north to south. This support is the heartbeat of the war, and it is a war of unparalleled brutality. Simple farmers are the targets of assassination and kidnapping. Women and children are strangled in the night because their men are loyal to their government. And helpless villages are ravaged by sneak attacks. Large-scale raids are conducted on towns and terror strikes in the heart of cities. The confused nature of this conflict cannot mask the fact that it is the new face of an old enemy. Over this war and all Asia is another reality, the deepening shadow of communist China. Why are these realities our concern? Why are we in South Vietnam? We are there because we have a promise to keep. Since 1954, every American president has offered support to the people of South Vietnam. We have helped to build and we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence, and I intend to keep that promise. To dishonor that pledge, to abandon this small and brave nation to its enemies and to the terror that must follow would be an unforgivable wrong. We're also there to strengthen world order. Around the globe, from Berlin to Thailand, are people whose well-being rests in part on the belief that they can count on us if they are attacked. To leave Vietnam to its fate would shake the confidence of all these people in the value of an American commitment and in the value of America's word. The result would be increased unrest and instability and even wider war. We're also there because there are great stakes in the balance. Let no one think for a moment that retreat from Vietnam would bring an end to conflict. The battle would be renewed in one country and then another. The central lesson of our time is that the appetite of aggression is never satisfied. To withdraw from one battlefield means only to prepare for the next. We must say in Southeast Asia, as we did in Europe, in the words of the Bible, "Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further." There are those who say that all our effort there will be futile, that China's power is such that it is bound to dominate all Southeast Asia. But there is no end to that argument until all of the nations of Asia are swallowed up. There are those who wonder why we have a responsibility there. Well, we have it there for the same reason that we have a responsibility for the defense of Europe. World War II was fought in both Europe and Asia, and when it ended, we found ourselves with continued responsibility for the defense of freedom. Our objective is the independence of South Vietnam and its freedom from attack. We want nothing for ourselves, only that the people of South Vietnam be allowed to guide their own country in their own way. We will do everything necessary to reach that objective, and we will do only what is absolutely necessary. In recent months, attacks on South Vietnam were stepped up. Thus, it became necessary for us to increase our response and to make attacks by air. This is not a change of purpose. It is a change in what we believe that purpose requires. We do this in order to slow down aggression. We do this to increase the confidence of the brave people of South Vietnam who have bravely borne this brutal battle for so many years with so many casualties. And we do this to convince the leaders of North Vietnam and all who seek to share their conquest of a very simple fact. We will not be defeated. withdraw, either openly or under the cloak of a meaningless agreement. We know that our attacks alone will not accomplish all of these purposes, but it is our best and prayerful judgment that they are a necessary part of the surest road to peace. We hope that peace will come swiftly, but that is in the hands of others besides ourselves. And we must be prepared for a long, continued conflict. It will require patience as well as bravery, the will to endure as well as the will to resist. I wish it were possible to convince others with words of what we now find it necessary to say with guns and planes. Armed hostility is futile. Our resources are equal to any challenge because we fight for values and we fight for principles rather than territory or colonies. Our patience and our determination are unending. Once this is clear, then it should also be clear that the only path for reasonable men is the path of peaceful settlement. Such peace demands an independent South Vietnam, securely guaranteed and able to shape its own relationships to all others, free from outside interference, tied to no alliance, a military base for no country. These are the essentials of any final settlement. We will never be second in the search for such a peaceful settlement in Vietnam. There may be many ways to this kind of peace, in discussion or negotiation with the governments concerned, in large groups or in small ones, in the reaffirmation of old agreements or their strengthening with new ones. We have stated this position over and over again, 50 times and more, to friend and foe alike, and we remain ready with this purpose for unconditional discussions. And until that bright and necessary day of peace, we will try to keep conflict from spreading. We have no desire to see thousands die in battle, Asians or Americans. We have no desire to devastate that which the people of North Vietnam have built with toil and sacrifice. We will use our power with restraint and with all the wisdom that we can command. But we will use it. This war, like most wars, is filled with terrible irony. For what do the people of North Vietnam want? They want their neighbors. What they want, their neighbors also desire. Food for their hunger, health for their bodies, a chance to learn, progress for their country, and an end to the bondage of material misery. And they would find all of these things far more readily in peaceful association with others than in the endless course of battle.
Dalek writes, Johnson's appeal convinced neither critics at home nor opponents abroad. His assumptions that a communist victory in Vietnam would extend to all of Southeast Asia, that the area was vital to U.S. security, and that a failure to fight in Vietnam would undermine our influence around the world and might even lead to a war with China and Russia, seemed no more persuasive after his speech than before. Moreover, though Johnson told Bill Moyers that Ho will never be able to say no to a billion-dollar development program, the North Vietnamese leader did just that. Johnson's New Deal evangelism, his experience with the transformation of rural Texas and the South, and his underestimation of Ho's commitment to the unification of Vietnam and distrust of what he saw as neocolonialism, a Western capitalist state exploiting Vietnam, clouded Johnson's judgment about Ho's response. Yet Johnson himself, in a moment of greater realism about Southeast Asia, had declared, "If I were Ho Chi Minh, I would never negotiate." Ho, in fact, said the same thing. The war could end only if the United States totally withdrew from the South and ceased attacking the North, and Saigon shared political power with the Viet Cong. In February, Johnson met with the National Education Association, the group voting to endorse the ESEA. On March 26, the House passed the Education Bill 263 to 153. Johnson responded by insisting the Senate pass the same law to avoid a conference committee which would cause mischief. On April 9th, the Senate passed the House version of the educational bill in a vote of 73 to 18. On April 11th, Johnson signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act at a ceremony taking place at a dilapidated small building just a mile and a half from his ranch. Attending the ceremony were his first teacher, Katie Dedrich Looney, a classmate, some of the Mexican-American students he taught in Cotilla, debate team members he coached in Sam Houston High School, and various Washington dignitaries. At a White House ceremony 2 days later, Johnson declared, "Take it from me, I worked harder and longer on this measure than on any measure I have worked on since I came to Washington in 1931, and I am proud of it." Johnson had limited reach in administering the law, delegating the work to administration officials while he himself was preoccupied with passing other bills and managing foreign affairs. Historian Alan J. Matasow noted that Johnson thought Title I of the ESEA was an anti-poverty reform, but that local officials ensured this would not be the case. A 1977 sample survey revealing that almost 2/3 of the students in the program funded by Title I were not poor. 8 years later, the National Institute of Education estimated half the funds spent under the law went to children living above the poverty line. Educators would also find poverty had more to do with family background and general social context than either the quality or quantity of education received by the child, and later assessments found that poor children helped by the ESEA reading and math programs had benefits which faded quickly and left students barely better off than those who had not used the program. On April 24th, a constitutionalist counter-coup disrupted the U.S. Embassy in Santo Domingo and the State Department, Washington initially adopting a wait-and-see policy as it was both reluctant to abandon the existing regime and convinced that the rebels were too weak to gain control. The uprising gained strength by the following day, and the embassy maintained the U.S. should not intervene. The next 3 days made it apparent that the rebellion was a counter-coup intended to both restore constitutional rule and possibly bring Juan Bosch back to power. Johnson watched developments closely, telling the State Department to keep him informed of the happenings. A high-ranking Pentagon officer remembered that Johnson was immediately drawn into that and took a very active and vigorous stand. Johnson received reports of organized left-wing groups trying to advance the possibility of a Castro-type government in Santo Domingo, and that anarchy and violence were claiming hundreds of lives and putting American citizens in danger. The president saw no alternative to sending Marines when Bennett cabled a request for their presence, and hours later, the president told congressional leaders that the threat to American lives was the basis for his action. After CIA Director Admiral William Raborn reported that 3 ringleaders of the rebels were Castro-trained agents, and Senator Dirksen and House Speaker McCormick expressed worry of the communist threats, Johnson replied that there was no alternative to the actions being taken by the United States in view of the unanimous recommendations received from all response officials. He further explained the use of troops as necessary to assure American safety in a public statement later that evening. The next evening, Johnson met with New York Times journalist Charles Moore and emphasized his desire to save lives. Dalek writes that Johnson did not want to open himself to additional criticism as a knee-jerk anti-communist who saw a military solution to every left-wing threat around the globe. When John B. Martin, the former ambassador to Santo Domingo, said that the last thing they wanted to see was U.S. troops shooting up a capital city, Johnson replied, "No, it isn't. The last thing we want to have happen is a communist takeover in that country." Johnson gave a speech on the evening of April 30th, explaining that violence and disorder were increasing in the island as foreign nationals and Dominicans remained in danger, announcing an OAS mission to the island intended to arrange a ceasefire and promote a democratic solution to the conflict. 2 days later, the crisis stagnant, Johnson increased the number of troops to the island. While the mass of Americans approved his policy, congressional critics, the media, and universities disputed his version of events, not believing that the communist threat in the island was what LBJ presented it to be, or that the American government was ready to stand aside when the Dominicans determined their political fate. Dalek writes that Johnson shared the doubts of his detractors, but felt domestic pressures compelled him to act. If Americans were killed or a left-wing government took over, conservative critics in the U.S. would denounce his failure to act. The situation in the Dominican Republic was so murky that it did not lead itself to clear demonstrations and consequently left Johnson vulnerable to criticisms he could not refute. He engaged in what Dalek calls verbal overkill to persuade critics, telling reporters in the Oval Office that some 1,500 innocent people were murdered and shot and their heads cut off, and 6 Latin American embassies were violated and fired upon over a period of 4 days before we went in. As we talked to our ambassador to confirm the horror and the tragedy and the unbelievable fact that they were firing on Americans in the American embassy, he was talking to us from under a desk while bullets were going through the windows, and he had 1,000 American men, women, and children assembled in the hotel who were pleading with their president for help to preserve their lives. His hyperbole won few converts and led to criticism of him as either misinformed or a liar. The crisis would only last a short time, the Dominicans signing a ceasefire agreement on May 5th. Dalek writes that the crisis seemed to deepen the feeling in the press and among the public that he was out of his depth in foreign affairs. The exaggerated explanations for his decision to send in troops and the questions raised about his candor and dispassion in the crisis caused Newsweek, for example, to describe the president as touchy, bitter, and exasperated by the complexities and unmanageability of foreign events. Worse yet, from Johnson's perspective, the doubts raised by the Dominican problem translated into additional questions about the wisdom and likely outcome of policy towards Vietnam. One of the chief consequences of the Dominican crisis for Johnson was a heightened sense of urgency in identifying and following an unwavering course in Vietnam. He believed it essential, if he were to convince supporters and opponents at home and abroad, that he had an effective strategy for meeting the challenge in Southeast Asia. Between April 12th and 14th, Johnson told senators that the aggressive use of American Marines were producing 3 times the casualties of communists as before, and they would need to send in army forces in order to sustain this trend and bring peace to South Vietnam. Johnson approved the deployment of 2 army brigades to guard bases in Vietnam the following day, and after Ambassador Taylor protested U.S. troops would be bogged down in an unwinnable land war and challenged the decision, the president suspended the order until advisors could get out of the Honolulu conference deployment on April 20th. The 21st saw McNamara report that Honolulu conferees backed adding 2 army brigades, 3 more Marine battalions, and logistical troops. At an April 27th press conference, Johnson said, "We are engaged in a crucial struggle in Vietnam. Some may consider it a small war, but to the men who give their lives, it is the last war and the stakes are high. Independent South Vietnam has been attacked by North Vietnam. The object of that attack is total conquest. Defeat in South Vietnam would deliver a friendly nation to terror and repression. It would encourage and spur on those who seek to conquer all free nations that are within their reach. Our own welfare, our own freedom would be in great danger. This is the clearest lesson of our time. From Munich until today, we have learned that to yield to aggression brings only greater threats and brings even more destructive war. To stand firm is the only guarantee of a lasting peace. At every step of the way, we have used our great power with the utmost restraint. We have made every effort possible to find a peaceful solution. We have done this in the face of the most outrageous and brutal provocation against Vietnamese and against Americans alike. On May 10th, Johnson decided to end the bombing for a limited period. The U.S. requested Russia inform North Vietnam of their intentions, but the Soviets declined to act as an intermediary. Attempts by the U.S. to deliver messages directly to North Vietnam were met with returns. Hanoi continued infiltrating the South and denounced the pause as it continued its attacks. The bombing resumed on May 18th. By mid-June, the total of American troops in Vietnam had increased by 150% to 82,000. At a meeting on June 23rd, Ball expressed support for the 100,000 troop limit and switching attention to Thailand in 3 months if Vietnam's conditions did not improve. Rusk and McNamara disagreed, believing it would lead to Southeast Asia being overtaken by communists, and McNamara urged greater troop commitments if conditions called for them. Johnson did not interject his own views and asked Ball and McNamara to prepare studies that covered military and political moves over the next 3 months and beyond. Wanting the studies in a week, without giving any assurances that the issue of large troop commitments would be decided by then. Johnson thought the courts would be the primary opponent to the Great Society laws, as he remembered FDR's struggle with the Supreme Court and Congress in 1937 over the constitutionality of New Deal measures. Saying at a cabinet meeting, "I saw FDR sweep everything before him in Congress. His majorities were greater than ours. There were no distractions abroad. He seemed able to get anything and everything he wanted. Then he lost the court bill. And from that Congress to this, no really major social legislation was enacted." In July, Justice William O. Douglas urged LBJ to nominate Abe Fortas, noting that he could still serve you and the country too. Dalek writes that this meant Johnson could rely on Fortas for personal and political matters while he was on the court, and that the president viewed Fortas as having the potential to be an excellent justice and deserving of such a reward as a Supreme Court nomination. Fortas had resisted taking a government post, being content earning money from his private Washington law practice. Fortas had previously declined serving as Johnson's Attorney General after RFK resigned the post the previous year. Carol Agger, Fortas's wife, served as the principal impediment to the appointment, believing her husband should wait 5 to 6 years to become an associate justice and did not want their lives altered at a time when they were thriving. Fortas himself did not want to pass up a chance to be on the Supreme Court, though he wanted to pretend that he was forced into an appointment by Johnson's insistence. The two arranged a conspiracy. Fortas sent Johnson a letter on July 19th declining the offer, and on July 28th, Johnson requested Fortas come to the White House. He told him that he was going to announce sending 50,000 troops to Vietnam and Fortas's appointment to the court, with the latter needing to follow the lead of those men by making a sacrifice for the country. Carroll was furious with LBJ, hanging up on the president when he tried to explain why he needed her husband on the bench. Fortas later told a law partner that he had never seen someone talk to the president like Carroll did, and she would privately complain about the dirty trick Johnson had played. Fortas's confirmation hearings in August were short and uneventful, the lawyer downplaying his relationship with Johnson amid fears by senators that this would compromise his judicial independence. There are two things that have been vastly exaggerated with respect to me. One is the extent to which I am a presidential advisor, and the other is the extent to which I am a proficient violinist. I am a very poor violinist, but very enthusiastic, and my relationship with the president has been exaggerated out of all connection with reality. Fortas was confirmed by the Senate on August 11th via voice vote. Russell Long, wanting to show his independence of Johnson after aligning with him on civil rights, and an opponent of government interference in healthcare, proposed an insurance amendment that would transform the Medicare bill. Long was able to persuade committee members to vote for his proposal without even reading it. A series of telephone calls rebuking committee members for their votes and lobbying from Medicare advocates saw the committee's action reversed. Congress passed the Medicare bill on July 28th. On July 30th, Johnson, in the presence of former President Truman at the Truman Library, signed the Social Security amendments of 1965 into law, creating Medicare and Medicaid. He said in part, "The need for this action is plain, and it is so clear indeed that we marvel not simply at the passage of this bill, but what we marvel at is that it took so many years to pass it. And I am so glad that Amy Foran is here to see it finally passed and signed," one of the first authors. There are more than 18 million Americans over the age of 65. Most of them have low incomes. Most of them are threatened by illness and medical expenses that they cannot afford. And through this new law, Mr. President, every citizen will be able, in his productive years when he is earning, to insure himself against the ravages of illness in his old age. This insurance will help pay for care in hospitals, in skilled nursing homes, or in the home, and under a separate plan it will help meet the fees of the doctors. Now here is how the plan will affect you. During your working years, the people of America, you, will contribute through the Social Security program a small amount each payday for hospital insurance protection. For example, the average worker in 1966 will contribute about $1.50 per month. The employer will contribute a similar amount, and this will provide the funds to pay up to 90 days of hospital care for each illness, plus diagnostic care, and up to 100 home health visits after you are 65. And beginning in 1967, you will also be covered for up to 100 days of care in a skilled nursing home after a period of hospital care, and under a separate plan when you are 65 that the Congress originated itself in its own good judgment, you may be covered for medical and surgical fees whenever you are in or out of the hospital. You will pay $3 per month after you are 65, and your government will contribute an equal amount. The benefits under the law are as varied and broad as the marvelous modern medicine itself. If it has a few defects, such as the method of payment of certain specialists, then I am confident those can be quickly remedied, and I hope they will be. No longer will older Americans be denied the healing miracle of modern medicine. No longer will illness crush and destroy the savings that they have so carefully put away over a lifetime, and that they might enjoy dignity in their later years. No longer will young families see their own income and their own hopes eaten away simply because they are carrying out their deep moral obligations to their parents and to their uncles and their aunts. And no longer will this nation refuse the hand of justice to those who have given a lifetime of service and wisdom and labor to the progress of this progressive country. And this bill, Mr. President, is even broader than that. It will increase Social Security benefits for all of our older Americans. It will improve a wide range of health and medical services for Americans of all ages. In 1935, when the man that both of us love so much, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed the Social Security Act, he said it was, and I quote him, "a cornerstone in a structure which is being built, but it is by no means complete." Well, perhaps no single act in the entire administration of the beloved Franklin D. Roosevelt really did more to win him the illustrious place in history that he has, as did the laying of that cornerstone. Dalek writes that Congress and Johnson took pains to win the support of hospitals and physicians, which included giving no real controls over hospitals or physicians that allowed hospitals to determine how much they would be reimbursed for reasonable cost, and physicians being paid customary fees with no regulation on the freedom of doctors to raise charges each year and submit higher fees as billing history. This generosity led to staggering increases in medical costs across the U.S., with the $3.5 billion of the program's first year rising to $144 billion by 1993, and the 5% of gross national product that Americans spent on healthcare in 1965 ballooning nearly threefold over the next 30 years, the result of both increased insurance availability and no controls on Medicare costs. Dalek concludes that while benefits to the elderly and indigent were indisputable, they did not solve the problem of care at reasonable cost for all Americans. Johnson's reforms were only a partial and imperfect solution to a dilemma that other industrialized societies have addressed more successfully. On August 6th, at the Capitol Rotunda, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law.
So let me now say to every Negro in this country, you must register. You must vote. You must learn, so your choices advance your interest and the interest of our beloved nation. Your future and your children's future depend upon it, and I don't believe that you are going to let them down. This act is not only a victory for Negro leadership. This act is a great challenge to that leadership. It is a challenge which cannot be met simply by protests and demonstrations. It means that dedicated leaders must work around the clock to teach people their rights and their responsibilities, and to lead them to exercise those rights and to fulfill those responsibilities and those duties to their country. And if you do this, then you will find, as others have found before you, that the vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison men because they're different from other men.
Dalek writes that the law's impact on the South was evident immediately, as the year would end with only 4 states of the old Confederacy having less than 50% of their eligible to vote blacks registered. In the 12-year period between 1968 and 1980, the number of Southern black elected state and federal officials almost doubled, and white politicians seeking black votes would stop using what Dalek calls the region's traditional racial demagoguery. By 1989, the few hundred black office holders in 1965 would grow to 6,000. Between August 11th to 16th, the Watts riots began in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. Dalek writes that although the location seemed unlikely to be the center of protest, it was as full of joblessness, crime, suffering, and hopelessness about escaping the miseries of black urban life as any other ghetto in America. On the night of August 11th, a highway patrolman arrested an unemployed 21-year-old black man believed to have been drunk driving. His mother rushed out to the scene before hundreds of residents gathered around, some of whom threw rocks at police. The night of August 12th saw 5,000 blacks riot, burning and looting, along with sniping at police. The disorder would cost 34 lives and $33 million in property damage. Ramsey Clark would later say that LBJ saw just as clearly as Reagan the effect of the Watts riots on the American people, the fear that it caused, and the hatred that flowed from the fear. Johnson was initially stunned, wondering how they could happen after the great advances in civil rights over the past 2 years, and Clark at first thought the facts were being distorted when an assistant came to his office to report on a major riot happening in Los Angeles. After Watts, Johnson decided to largely eliminate Humphrey's role as the chairman of the President's Council on Equal Opportunity. Johnson had Humphrey to publicly take the lead in putting himself on the sidelines of civil rights. Humphrey, though surprised by Johnson's choice, abided by the president's wishes and in his memoirs would blame Joseph Califano for wanting power but being against sharing it. Later that month, the House passed the immigration bill on August 25th. On September 2nd, the Senate passed the Higher Education Act in a vote of 79-3, the only dissenters being Mississippi Democrats James Eastland and John Stennis and Virginia Senator A. Willis Robertson. In a statement, Johnson called the legislation the most comprehensive program for higher education in our history, and noted that the act has many provisions, but it has only one purpose: to nourish human potential today so our nation can realize its rich promise tomorrow. On September 9th, Johnson signed the bill establishing the Department of Housing and Urban Development, saying in part, "In less than a lifetime, in less than my own 57 years, America has become a highly urbanized nation, and we must face the many meanings of this new America. Social change in our country is often faster than the mind of a generation can comprehend. But the pace of our urbanization has been stunning. It will move still faster in the immediate years ahead. Between now and the end of the century, our urban population will double. City land will double. In the next 35 years, we must literally build a second America, putting in place as many houses, schools, apartments, parks, and offices as we have built through all the time since the Pilgrims arrived on these shores." The physical challenge is awesome, but there is a challenge to the spirit that is even greater and more demanding. It is not enough for us to erect towers of stone and glass, or to lay out vast suburbs of order and conformity. We must seek and we must find the ways to preserve and to perpetuate in the city the individuality, the human dignity, the respect for individual rights, the devotion to individual responsibility that has been part of the American character, and the strength of the American system. Our cities and our new urban age must not be symbols of a sordid society. The history of every civilization teaches us that those who do not find new means to respond to new challenges will perish or decay. Unless we seize the opportunities available now, the fears some have of a nightmare society could materialize. Unless we match our imagination and our courage and our affluence, we could fail both our past and our posterity. So the enactment of this legislation, and so many other measures of this Congress, represents the unified determination of this generation to preserve the best of the past by preparing to make the future better still. The Senate passed the immigration bill on September 22nd. On September 24th, Johnson signed Executive Order 11246, prohibiting federal contractors and subcontractors from implementing employment discrimination and requiring them to take affirmative actions to prevent employment discrimination, which included the requirement that federal contractors create affirmative action programs. In January 2025, the order would be rescinded by President Donald Trump at the beginning of his non-consecutive second term. On October 3rd, Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act into law, the law eliminating the national origins formula and removing discrimination against Southern and Eastern Europeans, Asians, and other non-Western and Northern European ethnicities in American immigration policy. Johnson said, "This bill says simply that from this day forth, those wishing to immigrate to America shall be admitted on the basis of their skills and their close relationship to those already here. This is a simple test, and it is a fair test. Those who can contribute most to this country, to its growth, to its strength, to its spirit, will be the first that are admitted to this land." The fairness of this standard is so self-evident that we may well wonder that it has not always been applied. Yet the fact is that for over 4 decades, the immigration policy of the United States has been twisted and has been distorted by the harsh injustice of the national origins quota system. Under that system, the ability of new immigrants to come to America depended upon the country of their birth. Only 3 countries were allowed to supply 70% of all the immigrants. Families were kept apart because a husband or a wife or a child had been born in the wrong place. Men of needed skill and talent were denied entrance because they came from Southern or Eastern Europe or from one of the developing continents. This system violated the basic principle of American democracy, the principle that values and rewards each man on the basis of his merit as a man. It has been un-American in the highest sense, because it has been untrue to the faith that brought thousands to these shores even before we were a country. Today, with my signature, this system is abolished. He saluted the 89th Congress days later. From your committees and both your houses have come the greatest outpouring of creative legislation in the history of this nation. You passed legislation to fulfill the century-old promise of emancipation. Today, where once men were afraid, they now walk proudly to the polling place. You passed legislation to ease the burden of sickness and want for older Americans. Today, though millions must face old age, they are no longer dependent on kinfolk for their medical care. You passed legislation that should brighten every classroom in America. Once, the children of poverty began life on the hopeless road toward despair. Today, they have a new chance to hope and to achieve. You have promised to millions of American families better housing and better homes and a rebirth of our cities. You passed a poverty program so that poor families can train and work. You passed a bill that will meet head-on the nation's top murderers, cancer, heart disease, and stroke. You told our cities and our industries that they must stop polluting our water and poisoning our air. You passed legislation to dam our rivers to prevent floods, to produce power, and to provide beaches and playgrounds for our children. You gave us the blueprint for a rapid rail system to carry our commuters of tomorrow. You passed a farm bill that puts more income in the farmer's pocket and at the same time allows him to compete at home and abroad. You passed an immigration bill that no longer asks a man, "Where do you come from?" but "What can you do?" You have given local officials the tools to restore law and order on our streets. You passed the excise tax reduction. In a little over 20 months, at current income levels, taxes have been cut a little over $20 billion. And tonight, you serve notice on the spoilers of our landscape that we will battle with all we have to preserve the bounty of our land and the beauty of our countryside. On October 11th, the New York Times reported on former Vice President Nixon moving back into national leadership of the Republican Party. In his recent speeches and press conferences, Mr. Nixon has displayed his familiar skills and weaknesses. He is best at bridging the differences within his own party, not much liked by the party's liberals. He is sufficiently moderate in his views to be acceptable to them, and he has disavowed the Birch Society, but his remarks on the difficult and complex situation in Vietnam betray his old tendency to oversimplify issues and ruthlessly to exploit them for partisan ends. This tendency was what inspired the uneasiness about his judgment when he ran for president in 1960, and it was the root cause of his defeat. On October 22nd, Johnson signed the Highway Beautification Act of 1965 into law, remarking that the bill does more than control advertising in junkyards along the billions of dollars of highways that the people have built with their money, public money, not private money. It does more than give us the tools just to landscape some of those highways. This bill will bring the wonders of nature back into our daily lives. This bill will enrich our spirits and restore a small measure of our national greatness. On November 8th, Johnson signed the Higher Education Act, establishing college and university community service programs to help with solving urban and suburban issues. It gave funding to library acquisitions at colleges and universities, and for the training of librarians and information service specialists. Title IV, which Dowlett calls the law's most important and expensive part, gave scholarships, loans, and spending on federal work-study programs to help students. At the signing ceremony, Johnson said the bill would provide scholarships and loans and work opportunities to 1 million of that 1.3 million that did not get to go on to college. And when you, the first year with the first bill, take care of 1 million of that, 1.3 million through this legislation, we are hopeful that the state and the local governments and the local employers and the local loan funds can somehow take care of the other 300,000. So to thousands of young people, education will be available. And it is a truism that education is no longer a luxury. Education in this day and age is a necessity. Where a family cannot afford that necessity, we can now make available scholarships up to $1,000 a year, awarded on the basis of need alone to an individual. We can award part-time jobs so one student can earn as much as $400 a year. We can provide loans free of interest and free of any payment schedule until after you graduate to worthy, deserving, capable students. And in my judgment, this nation can never make a wiser or a more profitable investment anywhere. The second half of the year saw further developments in Vietnam. At the July 28th press conference, Johnson said, "Not long ago I received a letter from a woman in the Midwest. She wrote, 'Dear Mr. President, in my humble way, I am writing to you about the crisis in Vietnam. I have a son who is now in Vietnam. My husband served in World War II. Our country was at war, and now this time, it is just something that I don't understand. Why? Well, I have tried to answer that question dozens of times, and more, in practically every state in this union. I have discussed it fully in Baltimore in April, in Washington in May, in San Francisco in June. Let me again now discuss it here in the East Room of the White House. Why most young Americans born into a land exultant with hope and with golden promise, toil and suffer and sometimes die in such a remote and distant place? The answer, like the war itself, is not an easy one, but it echoes clearly from the painful lessons of half a century. 3 times in my lifetime, in 2 world wars and in Korea, Americans have gone to far lands to fight for freedom. We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace. It is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam. This is a different kind of war. There are no marching armies or solemn declarations. Some citizens of South Vietnam at times, with understandable grievances, have joined in the attack on their own government. But we must not let this mask the central fact that this is really war. It is guided by North Vietnam, and it is spurred by Communist China. Its goal is to conquer the South, to defeat American power, and to extend the Asiatic dominion of communism. There are great stakes in the balance. Most of the non-communist nations of Asia cannot, by themselves and alone, resist the growing might and the grasping ambition of Asian communism. Our power, therefore, is a very vital shield. If we are driven from the field in Vietnam, then no nation can ever again have the same confidence in American promise or in American protection. In each land, the forces of independence would be considerably weakened, and in Asia, so threatened by communist dominion, would certainly imperil the security of the United States itself. We did not choose to be the guardians at the gate, but there is no one else. Nor would surrender in Vietnam bring peace, because we learned from Hitler at Munich that success only feeds the appetite of aggression. The battle would be renewed in one country and in another country, bringing with it perhaps even larger and crueler conflict, as we have learned from the lessons of history. Moreover, we are in Vietnam to fulfill one of the most solemn pledges of the American nation. 3 presidents, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and your present president, over 11 years, have committed themselves and have promised to help defend the small and valiant nation. Strengthened by that promise, the people of South Vietnam have fought for many long years. Thousands of them have died. Thousands more have been crippled and scarred by war. We just cannot now dishonor our word or abandon our commitment or leave those who believed us and who trusted us to the terror and repression and murder that would follow. This, then, my fellow Americans, is why we are in Vietnam. Johnson sought to win the political war over Vietnam at home by taking aim at the media, Congress, and the public. On August 5th, Johnson told a National Security Council meeting, "We are getting only bad things from the press." In mid-September, the Washington Post reported Johnson was receiving more solid support for his policies in Vietnam than any other time since the fighting began to escalate in February, at 75% wanting Johnson to either hold the line or carry the conflict north, while only 25% wanted negotiations. That month, Senator Fulbright of Arkansas raised his voice against the administration's actions in both the Dominican Republic and Vietnam. While Fulbright had written LBJ of his belief that a dissenting view would aid both his administration and the U.S. with coming to grips with foreign policy questions, the president saw it only as an impediment. Previously, Johnson had kept Fulbright informed on Vietnam and engaged in private arguments about the war, once complaining to an aide in February 1965 that Fulbright was a crybaby and I can't continue to kiss him every morning before breakfast. Following the senator going public with his criticisms, Johnson never had another private conversation with him, and even aides to Fulbright found himself spurred by the president. In November, Eric Goldman told Johnson that administration pressure on Vietnam critics was being labeled liberal McCarthyism, and the advice did not sit well with the president. Dalek notes that a Lou Harris poll the previous June had shown Johnson with a 69% approval rating and 65% approval for his handling of Vietnam. 2 months later in August, Harris saw an overwhelming mandate to send as many U.S. troops there as necessary to withstand the Viet Cong attacks during monsoon season. By mid-September, there were reports from the Washington Post that Johnson had more solid support for his policies in Vietnam than any other time since the fighting began to escalate in February. In November, Gallup poll reported that in spite of public demonstrations, survey evidence indicates that American public opinion is moving toward greater support of U.S. military action in Vietnam. Harris's November survey showed LBJ with a 60% approval rating, and a month later, Harris recorded a 10-to-1 margin against American withdrawal from Vietnam. Despite the polls, Johnson was not convinced he had the public reliably behind the war, with one NSC staff member declaring in December, "The polls give the president high marks on Vietnam, but I have a vague feeling that this support may be more superficial than it is deep and committed. Many people probably do not even understand what it is they are supporting." Dalek writes, "When dissenters raised questions about the wisdom of fighting third world communists who had no power to directly injure the United States, it registered in Americans in ways that made Johnson and his advisors uncomfortable, for they also sensed that Vietnam did not have the hold on the public imagination that would allow for a long war, hence the administration's impulse to press the case for Vietnam, regardless of what the polls said. In these circumstances, why didn't Johnson seek some alternative other than escalation?" Historian Ernest May and political scientist Richard Neustadt posed a similar question in the study of the decision 20 years later. "The more often we review the case," they concluded, "the harder we find it to outline what LBJ could have said in 1965 to explain to the American people why he was dropping JFK's South Vietnamese allies, or alternatively, why he was beginning all-out war against Hanoi because of what impeded in Saigon." In trying to outline the speech Johnson could have given over television, they gravitated toward a conclusion that LBJ's one real alternative was one scarcely hinted at even by Ball, namely, another dose of the 1963 medicine, engineering a change of regime in Saigon, but this time to bring in a clique that would call for neutralization and American withdrawal. But when journalists picked up the scent, as they undoubtedly would, what then? One can imagine another scenario if Johnson had encouraged a wide-open debate in Congress and the press on what to do about Vietnam. It would, judging from the polls, have also led to escalation. Perhaps some great society legislation would have been shelved as a consequence, but given liberal majorities in Congress, it is hard fully to credit Johnson's fears. What seems reasonably sure, however, is that an expanded war following a debate would have meant a stronger, more stable commitment to the fighting. This by no means guaranteed an enduring consensus in the face of stalemate, defeat, and substantial casualties, but it would have put Johnson in a much stronger political position. Complaints about his credibility, objections to Lyndon Johnson's war with all the political difficulties these attacks entailed, could have been avoided. More important, escalation of the fighting by national agreement rather than Johnson's unilateral decisions would have placed him in a position to escape the war if and when it turned sour. As matters stood at the end of 1965, Johnson had committed the prestige of the country and his administration to a conflict that great numbers of Americans now felt we could not afford to lose.